In 1914, 28 men set out on a terrifyingly dangerous expedition to cross Antarctica, the most hostile and unforgiving environment on the planet. But their mission took a deadly turn when their ship became trapped by the unforgiving Antarctic ice, leaving them stranded and totally alone. Ernest Shackleton was an Anglo-Irish explorer who lived during the heroic age of Antarctic exploration, but this journey would test him like never before, pushing him and his crew to the very limits of survival. In this video, we'll explore the incredible story of Shackleton and his crew, how they survived from an impossibly hopeless position, and what this tale of resilience and leadership tells us about the triumph of the human spirit. Let's get into it. Chapter 1. Shackleton's Dream. At the turn of the 20th century, Antarctica was the ultimate frontier. The heroic age of exploration was in full swing, with adventurers risking their lives for glory, discovery, and national pride. For Ernest Shackleton, Antarctica was more than just a frozen wasteland. It was the ultimate challenge, a place where ambition collided with nature's raw power. Shackleton wasn't new to the ice. He'd been part of Captain Scott's Discovery expedition in 1901, where he endured near-fatal conditions and learned firsthand the dangers of polar exploration. And in 1909, he returned to Antarctica, coming tantalizingly close to the South Pole, falling just 97 miles short. A heartbreaking defeat, but one that only fueled his determination. That defeat came to Norwegian Roald Amundsen, who reached the South Pole first in 1911. But Shackleton's dream lived on, and it went beyond just planting a flag. He set his sights on an even greater prize: the first land crossing of Antarctica. Starting on the Weddell Sea coast, his team would traverse the entire continent, over 1,800 miles of ice, snow and glaciers, and emerge victorious on the shores of the Ross Sea. It was an audacious plan, one that would cement his legacy as one of the greatest explorers of all time. Thus, Shackleton called his mission the Imperial Transantarctic Expedition, a name as grand as his ambitions. To fund the expedition, he used his reputation to rally support, attracting wealthy donors, securing sponsorships, and even convincing the British government to contribute £10,000, a hugely significant sum at the time. He eventually assembled a fearsome crew of 27 men, a mix of experienced sailors, scientists, and adventurers. Now, Shackleton's method of choosing them was as unconventional as the man himself. He placed less emphasis on credentials and more on personality and resilience, knowing that survival in Antarctica depended on more than just skill. It required grit, optimism, and the ability to work together under unimaginable pressure. Thus, by August 1914, the team was ready to set sail. However, the First World War had just broken out in Europe. Shackleton, ever the patriot, offered to postpone the expedition and place his ship and crew at the service of the Royal Navy. But the Admiralty urged him to proceed, believing his mission would inspire hope during a time of uncertainty. And so Shackleton's dream set sail. But none of them knew that this journey would end not in triumph, but in one of the most extraordinary stories of survival the world has ever known. Chapter 2. The Endurance Sets Sail. In August 1914, Shackleton's ship, the Endurance, slips away from Plymouth, carrying Shackleton's dream of conquering Antarctica and the hopes of 27 men eager to prove themselves. The ship was a marvel of its time, 128 feet long and reinforced with oak to withstand the ice. Shackleton chose the name Endurance as a nod to his family motto: "By endurance we conquer." It was fitting, though no one yet realised just how prophetic it would become. The journey to Antarctica began with optimism. The Endurance sailed across the Atlantic, making its first stop at Buenos Aires to pick up final supplies and a stowaway, Percy Blackborough, a young man desperate for adventure. From there, the ship continued south, stopping briefly at South Georgia Island to stockpile coal and receive final warnings from seasoned whalers about the dangers of the Weddell Sea. The Weddell Sea was notorious for its ice, vast, ever-shifting, and impenetrable at times. Local whalers had seen entire ships swallowed by its frozen grip, and they cautioned Shackleton about the risk of navigating too far. But Shackleton was undeterred. To him, risk was part of the adventure, and the Endurance pressed onward, leaving South Georgia behind on December the 5th, 1914. However, as the ship ventured deeper into the Antarctic, the ice began to close in, making progress slow and dangerous. By January 1915, things got bad, and the Endurance became trapped in pack ice, unable to break free despite repeated attempts to maneuver through. Shackleton ordered men onto the ice with ice chisels, saws, and picks to try and force a passage, but the labour proved futile. Shackleton did not at this stage abandon all hope of breaking free, but was now contemplating the possibility of having to spend a winter in the inhospitable arms of the pack. However, by February it was clear that the Endurance would not move again until the ice released her. The ship was completely frozen in place, a helpless island in an endless sea of white. So Shackleton made the bold decision that he dreaded. They would winter on the ice, turning the ship into a floating base camp while they waited for a thaw. He knew that keeping morale high was critical and devised a strict routine of daily tasks, recreational activities, and group meals to prevent despair from taking hold. Despite the mounting challenges, Shackleton never allowed fear to seep into his men. He maintained an unshakable front of optimism, reassuring them that they would find a way forward. Optimism is the true moral courage, he reminded them, a mantra that would become their lifeline in the months ahead. For now, the Endurance stood firm against the ice, her hull creaking under pressure but holding strong. The men continued to hope that, with the arrival of spring, the ice would break and they could resume their journey. But the Antarctic had other plans. As the ice shifted and tightened its grip, the Endurance began to groan ominously, hinting at the ordeal to come. Therefore, what had started as an expedition of glory and discovery was slowly transforming into something far more harrowing, a fight for survival. The men of the Endurance had no choice but to adapt, to endure, and to follow Shackleton into the unknown. Chapter 3. The Struggle for Survival. By the winter of 1915, the Endurance was no longer a ship. It was a prison, trapped in the merciless grip of the Weddell sea ice. For months and months the men waited, hoping for a thaw to free their vessel. But the ice grew only more relentless. Shackleton and his crew were now at the mercy of the Antarctic, with no way forward and no way back. The Endurance groaned under the pressure of the ice, her wooden frame bending and splintering as the frozen sea closed in around her. When the timbers broke, they made noises which sailors later described as being similar to the sound of heavy fireworks and the blasting of guns. By October, the situation had turned critical. Shackleton gave the inevitable order to abandon ship, and the men watched helplessly as their once sturdy vessel was crushed and sank beneath the ice. Their lifeline was gone, and they were now totally alone on a shifting, hostile wilderness. At this point, survival became the only goal. Shackleton set to work organising a new plan. The men salvaged what they could from the wreck, supplies, tools, and the lifeboats, which would become their last hope of escape. Every ounce of food was carefully rationed, and their meals consisted of seal meat, penguin, and later, the dogs they had brought to pull sleds. It was a grim necessity, but Shackleton's leadership kept morale from breaking. Life on the ice was brutal. The men endured weeks of freezing temperatures, relentless winds, and near-constant darkness during the polar night. They built makeshift shelters and huddled together for warmth, their survival dependent on teamwork and determination. Shackleton made it his mission to ensure that every man stayed mentally and physically engaged, assigning tasks to keep them busy and organised. However, as the ice drifted northwards, Shackleton devised a new, daring plan. When the ice broke apart, they would launch the 3 lifeboats, their only chance of reaching safety. For months they dragged these boats across jagged ice floes, an exhausting and dangerous task. Men fell into freezing water, frostbite claimed fingers and toes, and exhaustion became a constant companion. But by April 1916, after over a year stranded on the ice, the floes began to break apart, signalling the time to launch the boats. Shackleton went for it. He and his men braved frigid waters in the tiny lifeboats, navigating through treacherous seas filled with icebergs and towering waves. The journey was a nightmare. Days of wet, sleepless misery, with the men battling hypothermia and starvation. After 7 harrowing days at sea, the boats finally reached the desolate Elephant Island, a barren outcrop of rock and ice far from any shipping lanes. It was the first solid ground the men had stood on in over 15 months. But their ordeal was far from over. Elephant Island offered no hope of rescue. They were still completely isolated. Therefore, Shackleton knew there was only one way to save his crew: to sail for help. A journey of nearly 800 miles across the most dangerous ocean in the world. Thus, taking 5 of his strongest men, he prepared for what would become one of the most remarkable feats of navigation and endurance in human history. The struggle for survival was far from over, but Shackleton's men had one thing that the ice, the cold, and the sea could never take from them: the will to endure. Chapter 4. The Unbelievable Journey. On April 24th, 1916, Shackleton and 5 of his men set out on what many believe to have been a suicide mission, an 800-mile journey across the ocean in a 22-foot lifeboat, the James Caird. Their destination was South Georgia Island, a remote speck in the Atlantic and home to a whaling station that could send help to rescue the rest of the crew that was stranded on Elephant Island. The odds were staggering. The James Caird was not built for open ocean travel, let alone the ferocious conditions of the Southern Ocean. Towering waves, freezing temperatures, and howling winds battered the tiny boat day and night. The men, soaked to the bone and huddled together for warmth, battled seasickness, frostbite, and exhaustion. Ice coated the rigging and hull, threatening to sink them at every turn. Shackleton, ever the optimist and leader, kept the crew focused and determined. With no modern navigation tools, they relied entirely on Frank Worsley, the ship's captain, who used a sextant and brief glimpses of the sun to plot their course. One miscalculation, and they would sail into the endless expanse of the Atlantic, doomed to perish in the waves. For 16 days they battled the ocean. The men bailed water endlessly, their hands raw and numb. Their rations dwindled, and sleep was impossible. Storms raged, with waves so high they seemed to blot out the sky. But through it all, Shackleton remained steadfast, encouraging his men and refusing to let despair take hold. Finally, on May the 8th, 1916, after weeks of unimaginable hardship, the James Caird sighted land. South Georgia Island. Relief must have washed over the crew at this point, but their journey was far from over. Gale force winds prevented them from landing on the island's western side, forcing them to navigate around the treacherous coastline to find a safe harbour. Even then, they were too weak to row to shore and had to wait another harrowing night at sea before finally landing. When they reached the shore, the men were too exhausted to celebrate. And besides, the mission was only halfway complete. Help was on the opposite side of the island, and they were stranded on the uninhabited southern coast. To reach the whaling station, they would have to trek across South Georgia's mountainous interior, a feat no one had even attempted before. And remember, these men were utterly malnourished and exhausted. So, with nothing but nails in their boots for traction, a makeshift rope, and incredible determination, the group began their trek across the island's frozen peaks and glaciers. They marched without rest, navigating by instinct and sheer willpower. At times, they slid down icy slopes to save time, risking death with every descent. Finally, after 36 grueling hours, they stumbled into the whaling station at Stromness, ragged, frostbitten, and unrecognisable. When Shackleton introduced himself to the astonished whalers, the first question they asked was, "Who are you?" Shackleton's reply was simple but triumphant. "My name is Shackleton." With help secured, Shackleton immediately turned his focus to rescuing the men left behind on Elephant Island. Though he had completed the James Caird's unbelievable journey, he knew his mission wasn't over until every single one of his crew was safe. The journey of the James Caird remains one of the most incredible stories of navigation, survival and endurance in the whole of human history. It wasn't just a test of physical strength, but of unyielding resolve, no matter the cost. But there were still men to save. Chapter 5. The Final Rescue. When Ernest Shackleton stepped into the whaling station at Stromness on May the 20th, 1916, he looked like a man returned from the dead. His frostbitten face, tattered clothes, and sunken eyes told the story of a journey few could survive. But for Shackleton, there was no time to rest or celebrate. 22 men were still stranded on the desolate Elephant Island, waiting, hoping for rescue. Shackleton's immediate priority was securing a ship capable of navigating the treacherous waters of the Southern Ocean. South Georgia's whaling vessels were too small for the task, so he sought help from the Chilean and British governments. His first attempt was aboard a ship called the Southern Sky, but it was stopped by ice. Two more attempts with different vessels also failed to penetrate the unrelenting pack ice surrounding the island. Each failure weighed heavily on Shackleton, but he refused to give up. Finally, with the support of the Chilean government, Shackleton secured the Yelcho, a small steam tug ill-equipped for polar conditions. She had no proper heating or reinforced hull, but Shackleton was determined to push forward. On August 25th, 1916, Shackleton and the Yelcho set out for what would be their last, desperate attempt to save the remaining men. The journey was tense, every mile a battle against unpredictable seas and shifting ice. On August 30th, after 4 long months since leaving Elephant Island, Shackleton's persistence was finally rewarded. As the Yelcho approached the island, the stranded men spotted the ship and erupted into cheers and shouts. Frank Wild,
Shackleton's second-in-command, had kept the men alive in their leader's absence, and his first words to Shackleton upon seeing him were simple: "We knew you'd come back."
The rescue was swift. Within an hour, all 22 men were aboard the Yelcho, leaving behind the makeshift camp that they had called home for 137 days. Shackleton conducted a head count, and when he confirmed that every man was present, he turned to his crew and said with quiet pride, "They are all safe."
For the men of the Endurance, it was a moment of indescribable relief and joy. They had endured unimaginable hardships, freezing temperatures, starvation, and the mental toll of isolation, but their faith in Shackleton had never wavered. Not a single life was lost during the entire ordeal, a testament to Shackleton's extraordinary leadership and resilience. The Yelcho returned to Punta Arenas, Chile, where Shackleton and his men were hailed as heroes. Yet Shackleton himself was unassuming in the face of praise. He downplayed his role, saying only, "We did what we could."
The story of the Endurance expedition was far from the triumph and discovery that Shackleton had envisioned in 1914. Instead, it became a story of survival, unity, and the indomitable human spirit. Shackleton's ability to adapt to the circumstances, keep his men motivated, and never lose sight of their collective survival cemented his legacy as one of the greatest leaders in history. It's proof that the human spirit can triumph even when all seems lost. That's why his story continues to inspire us today, over a century later. Let me know what you think in the comments, and if you enjoyed this video, please consider subscribing to my channel.